27 of Give Me Liberty. The title of this chapter is From Triumph to Tragedy, 1989 to 2001. 1989 is chosen as this sort of breaking year because a new world order, as so it was called, was established with the United States as the global superpower. The fall of the Soviet Union took place in 1991, technically, but 1989 is when it started to go wrong for the Soviet Union. So as I said, 1989 is seen as this global turning point. A few examples of why: you could talk about Tiananmen Square in Beijing, where tens of thousands of students gathered and protested, demanding democracy in China for a couple months, from April to June. And in June, Chinese troops were sent in, and they actually killed an unknown number of people. Likely it was in the thousands. A lot of this information is still covered up even today, so it's unclear. Eventually, I'm sure the historical record will have the proper information, but for right now, we say it's likely in the thousands. And this was happening in conjunction with many different uprisings, pro-democracy uprisings across Eastern Europe in what was breaking up as the Soviet Union. November 9th of 1989 saw the Berlin Wall come down. This had divided East and West Germany, and it had been up since 1961. Germany was reunited as a nation, no longer East and West Germany, the following year in 1990. This fall of communism in Eastern Europe is oftentimes referred to as the Velvet Revolution, and this is because most of what happened was relatively non-violent, considering it was a revolution and separation of one Soviet Union into about 15 different countries. So usually one would associate a lot of violence with this sort of disintegration of a union, but it's a lot of violence to follow and not necessarily in the revolution itself. The Gulf War, this is oftentimes referred to as Operation Desert Storm, came to be because in 1990 Iraq invaded Kuwait, which had a large cache of oil, and they did so under Saddam Hussein's orders. He was the leader of Iraq at the time. And the U.S. had these fears that Saudi Arabia would be next, which also had a large cache of oil, which the United States was using. And in response to this invasion of Kuwait, President Bush, this is the first President Bush, George H.W. Bush, sent troops into Kuwait in order to put down the insurgency of the Iraqis. In February of 1991, the operation began in earnest, and it was known as Operation Desert Storm. And it turned out to be a relatively quick overtaking of Kuwait by the American forces. And the death tolls were much lower than in most military actions. It doesn't mean that this is great by any means. It's noteworthy that the death tolls were relatively low compared to previous military engagements. So there were under 300 Americans dead in the fighting, about 1,000 to 2,000 Kuwaitis, and around 20,000 Iraqi soldiers were killed. And Saddam Hussein remained in power in Iraq, so it wasn't as if the United States had gone into Iraq at this point to depose their leader. They simply weren't allowing them to expand into Kuwait. And following the Gulf War, U.S. troops remained stationed in Saudi Arabia, and this was particularly disliked by many in the region, especially by Osama bin Laden, which we will go over later in the lecture. this question came up at this point: what is America's role in the world? The Gulf War was justified as this U.S. protection of global free trade by securing the oil supply. Colin Powell, part of the Bush administration, was one of the few within that administration that had predicted that there would be widespread instability with multiple conflicts popping up in different and unthought of places post-Cold War. He cautioned the president and that U.S. troops should not be committed to any fight without having a clear stated mission and without having a timeline for withdrawal. So he suggested that the United States could find itself in a similar situation that it was in during the Vietnam War, which turned into a quagmire. They often talk about it as being a quagmire, like a sand pit that people couldn't get out of, and it just dragged on and on. And Dick Cheney, on the other hand, believed that the U.S. possessed the power to reshape the world and the duty to deny power to hostile nations. So he took more of a hawkish approach and encouraged H.W. Bush to do the same. The 1992 election was held between Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush. And George H.W. Bush was running for a second term. And what hurt him probably the most was an economic downturn during his first administration. And increasingly, his party, the Republican Party, seemed to be out of touch with the way many U.S. citizens were thinking at the time. There was a famous speech at the Republican National Convention by Pat Buchanan, which to many seemed like it was hearkening back to an older time, talking about being anti-gay and anti-feminist. And this turned a lot of people off to the Republican Party, and it opened up the door for Bill Clinton to step in, who was seen more as a centrist. He sort of straddled this line between being liberal and being conservative. He supported abortion rights, he supported gay rights, and affirmative action, and those are sort of typically grouped into the liberal camp. And in the conservative camp, he supported reduced governmental bureaucracy, and he supported changing welfare and changing the rules and changing how much people received, which are typically held within the Republican Party. Clinton was elected, even with a third-party candidate in Ross Perot receiving about 19% of the popular vote. So the popular vote was still nearly half for Clinton. It was about 43%. But 19% was taken up by Ross Perot, this third-party candidate, which is one of the largest third-party candidates percentage of the popular vote in a presidential election. And you can see on the map above the difference between the Electoral College vote and the popular vote. Clinton in office was sort of a mixed bag, as most of them are. And he's noted for having appointed the first female attorney general in Janet Reno. He also appointed 2 Supreme Court of the United States justices, in Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Stephen Breyer, who are both still serving as of this point. And one of his policies was to institute what is called Don't Ask, Don't Tell. It was legal at this point to dismiss gay and lesbian members of the military for their sexual orientation. So Clinton instituted a Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, telling people to keep it to themselves and they wouldn't be dismissed, rather than making it illegal for people to be dismissed based on their sexual orientation. So some people saw this as a win, that they were willing to look the other way, but some people also saw this as an affront that they were told not to discuss their personal lives for fear of being fired. He also was dedicated to raising the taxes on the wealthy and increased returns for lower income workers through the Earned Income Tax Credit, which helped about 4 million Americans get out of poverty. He also signed the NAFTA agreements between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. NAFTA stands for the North American Free Trade Agreement, and this is an attempt at increasing trade and reducing barriers between trade on the North American continent. His wife, Hillary Rodham Clinton, who later ran for president twice, spearheaded this healthcare overhaul. She was pushing for universal healthcare, but doctors and insurance companies joined forces with other opponents to strike it down. Part of the group attempting to strike down these sorts of movements was they called their movement the Freedom Revolution. There was a pushback in 1994 with the Republicans gaining both houses of Congress during the midterm elections. And Newt Gingrich, as the Speaker of the House, talked about this contract with America. He was focused on curtailing the government's power, cutting taxes, cutting regulations on both economic and environmental work, overhauling the welfare system, and ending affirmative action. So they wanted to loosen restrictions across the board, essentially. In 1995, the Republicans shut down the government over a budget disagreement, but this turned out to be really unpopular with the people, so they ended up having to retreat and reopen the government and find a middle ground. Some of this worked with Clinton's having taken a centrist turn. He ended aid to families with dependent children, the welfare program, and instead started providing grants to the states instead for them to dole out as they wished. And this pushback wasn't really enough to overtake the White House, and Clinton was reelected in 1996 against Republican Bob Dole. After he was reelected, and throughout his first term, he had to deal with international issues, as all presidents do. Two of the more infamous incidents during his administration were human rights related. So Jimmy Carter had been well known for making human rights part of his mission as president, and the idea of that carried forward, but the action didn't always necessarily follow. So in 1994, there was the Rwandan genocide, and over a span of 3 months, nearly 1 million people, at least 800,000 people, were murdered. And there were 2 million who fled from the country. The United States essentially did nothing to stop this, even though they were fully aware of what was happening and had agreed to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and were part of the UN, which had agreements to stop genocide should it be determined that it was happening. I've included here a clip from a popular movie for you from Hotel Rwanda. It's just to show you in sort of this Hollywood version, but still you'll get the point about people being confused that there would be no intervention. There's also a BBC clip here explaining the basics of the Rwandan genocide so that you have a fuller picture of why this happened. The year after the Rwandan genocide took place, the Bosnian genocide took place with the breakup of Yugoslavia, and this horrible term, ethnic cleansing, began being broadcast throughout the world. And what it essentially meant was killing people of different ethnicities, so same thing as genocide. If they didn't use the term genocide, they wouldn't be committed to intervening in the same way. And there were around 9,000 young Muslim men who were killed during this specific Srebrenica massacre. And the UN and the US sent peacekeeping forces to the region to intervene. I've included a similar clip here to explain the Bosnian genocide for you, but these are stains on Clinton's record. And there's been a lot of talk of why there was no intervention, specifically in Rwanda, over the years. And lots of different theories have flown about why there was no intervention, one of them being race, one of them being it was on the African continent, and some of it was fear that they would get it wrong, as they had in Vietnam, as they had in many other places throughout the Cold War. They'd gone in without fully understanding the situation and not understanding the country. So a mixed number of reasons why there was no intervention, but it still remains. These happened and there was no real intervention. Globalization is another process that was taking place during this time, and globalization refers to the process by which people, investment, goods, information, and culture increasingly flowed across national boundaries. So this is allowing information like the Rwandan genocide, for example, to reach the American people on their TVs at night. Satellites and the internet allowed for a lot of this to travel faster than it had at any other point in history. Obviously, the telegram had been a huge improvement in communication over the letter, but this just took it to an entirely different level. Part of the change in the speed of sharing culture and sharing information and sharing investment was the collapse of the Soviet Union. This allowed the concept of capitalism to spread further than it had already and opened up new markets for people to do business. There were a lot of anti-globalization efforts that were focused on the social consequences of this process. There were widening wealth gaps, and there was this dedication to attempting to determine international standards of conduct, because there weren't rules that everyone necessarily had to follow within the business world. And in 1999, there was a group of 30,000 people who protested the World Trade Organization's arrival in Seattle, and a lot of what they were protesting was these overseas factories, low-paying jobs, and environmental concerns from deregulation. As we mentioned, computers are part of what made this possible. With the rise of computer and technology, there was a turn also away from goods manufacturing, so making things in factories in the United States, and turning towards information. So the business of being in business, or the business of information. Computers had been around since World War II, but at that point they were mostly used for science and math, and they were enormous and slow-moving. You can see the top picture over here is of a computer around the World War II era, and sometimes they were as big as a room. They were gigantic. The microchip is what makes it possible to have smaller computers and now our phones, and this is a byproduct of the space program and their development of information storage for space travel and for military purposes. This microchip opened up a whole new realm of products and activities. It opened up camcorders, handheld video games, cell phones, and digital cameras. These things all came onto the market fairly quickly once the microchip was made stable and affordable. Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, the founders of Apple and Microsoft, are still some of the most recognizable names in the United States, if not the world. And by the year 2000, at least half of all the homes in the United States had a personal home computer. One thing that could be mentioned here, too, is that there is this giant fear in the year 2000 that the computers that everybody had and the computers that were in airplanes, the computers that were at banks, wouldn't be able to process the turnover from the 1900s to the year 2000. And this was a legitimate fear that a lot of people had. They imagined things like planes falling from the sky or everyone's money disappearing if it was left in the banks. And people were really, really fearful of this. Of course, nothing ended up happening and everything was fine. No planes falling out of the sky, no money gone missing. The computers did just fine. But it was this sort of sense of national panic that there might be something that happened. And the internet specifically is what mostly changed the way that computers were used, moving away from solely science and math. And the internet had been started as a high-speed military communications network, but it eventually came to be what it is now over the past couple decades, which, for better or for worse, has allowed us to instantaneously access basically anything that we could imagine. Part of what happened at the beginning, though, was there were all these different companies that were what were called .com companies. So they were companies that operated mostly online, and there was a massive amount of investment put into those companies when they came onto the scene. So when they entered into the Dow Jones market or the NASDAQ market, they received a lot of money. People were investing a lot. And part of what was really different about these companies was that they weren't necessarily always expected to make a profit. Many of them did not make a profit. And that still rings true today. Many large digital companies or .com companies don't end the fiscal year with a profit. There's a different sort of valuation that's put on these businesses, and people are investing in that. In April of 2000, the .com bubble burst, and this had the largest one-day point drop to that time in history. And it had declines for the next 2 years, which wiped out billions of dollars and sent the nation into a recession. And you'll notice throughout this session, we've been talking a lot about recessions. They happen pretty regularly. It just means that the nation is not growing its wealth, it's receding in its wealth. And corporate fraud was part of this boom and bust cycle at this point, as it often is. But the financial industry was still struggling with this, and there were many companies that ended up being punished for having committed fraud during this bubble buildup that eventually led to its downfall. Part of the issue here was deregulation. There were several sectors that had seen massive deregulation, which meant less oversight from the government, and these included the energy sector, telecommunications, and stock trading. And they all ended up being hotbeds of fraudulent activity that led to this bust and this false inflation of money that came before the bust. The Glass-Steagall Act, which had been put in place during the New Deal had tried to separate commercial banks from investment banks. And what it was trying to do was prevent risky investments with people's deposits in commercial banks where people were depositing their everyday money versus investment banks that were specifically tasked with trying to make the most money for those who gave them money. This was repealed in 1999 and meant that commercial banks could also take part in these riskier investments to try to make money off people's deposits. The financial crisis in the 2000s stems a lot from this era of deregulation under Clinton, and it included mortgage lending and eventually led to bailouts of banks that were deemed too big to fail. We'll talk about what too big to fail means a little bit later, but just keep in mind that this period of deregulation did lead to the opening up of these avenues for banks and other businesses to improperly invest money. This time frame also led to increased inequality. We keep talking about this throughout the 20th century, but again, it rears its head and continues to. There was rising inequality in wealth attainment at this point, with the poor and middle class on the decline and the top still moving up. At this point, Bill Gates had amassed the same amount of wealth as the bottom 40% of the entire nation combined. And manufacturing had largely gone overseas because the labor and operational costs were less expensive, and the regulations in the United States, even with deregulation, were still stricter than places like Mexico or Vietnam or China, where a lot of these companies ended up moving their facilities. And this meant that a lot of U.S. manufacturing workers were out of jobs. The business of the United States became business itself, essentially, at this point, rather than making products. So it became finance and accounting and business in general, business brokering. Walmart replaced GM at this point as the largest corporate employer. So GM had been in manufacturing for automobiles, but Walmart replaced it at this point and was known for paying near minimum wage and was anti-union, and by 2010 was actually the largest employer in Mexico as well. If these workers weren't making enough money from their jobs to pay for their basics, oftentimes people were on the rules for public assistance, and this meant that taxpayers were actually paying for the companies to choose to pay low wages. Culture wars, you can hear this term at this point, and you'll continue to hear this term. Lots of people still use it even today. But essentially, there was this belief that there was this splintering group identity, and there wasn't a real consensus model anymore or consensus culture, and that there were many different groups that were living within the United States. Of course, it had often been this way, but the optics of this changed. There was also a notable rise in secular culture across the globe during the 20th century, and especially nearing the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st. There was a backlash against this perceived nature of the secular rise as being obsessed with consumption and mass entertainment, and having lost any sense of value. And there was this repeated Great Awakening, third or fourth, depending on how you think about it, and this involved evangelical Christians in the United States, Hindu nationalists in India, Orthodox Jews in Israel, and Islamic fundamentalists in the Middle East. And people were known for having gone to the extremes of their religions in response to this spread of secularism. Immigration is part of this changing face of the nation. So from 1965 to 2010, there were 38 million immigrants who arrived in the United States. About 50% were Latinx and Caribbean, and 35% were Asian, and 10% were European, and most of that was fallout from the fall of the Soviet Union. The racial and religious makeup of the United States ended up being in flux from this influx of immigration, and there was less of a reliance on a consensus culture as there had been following World War II. Historically, it had mostly been young men who had sought out immigration, and at this point, women were immigrating more often because there were actually less manufacturing jobs for men to go into, and there were more open jobs in fields that women traditionally entered into, and those were childcare, elder care, and retail sales. Of course, there aren't gender-specific jobs, as we know, but there are jobs in which a particular gender has historically dominated. Questions of diversity come up with all these voices of different minority groups finally being heard. And the story of the United States had for a very long time been the story of black and white, and hardly any discussion of Asians or Latin Americans. And with this influx of different languages, different cultures, different backgrounds, this black and white story became more complicated. And obviously we know that story is extremely complicated from the beginning, and also included Native Americans. But the conversation had long focused on African Americans and white Americans. Interracial marriage was on the rise during the 1990s, and it had been legal since the Loving v. Virginia case in 1967, but in many cases it was still frowned upon in different states, and it wasn't quite the norm, but it was certainly becoming more accepted by larger and larger groups of people. The birth rates for minorities tended to be higher than that of white Americans, which means that eventually there would no longer be a white majority in the United States, and that it would be a little more balanced, racially speaking. The term Latinos was in use for a long time, but it's easier to say Latinx, meaning Latinos and Latinas, no gender-specific identity involved in the title. So this is a catch-all phrase that was used to refer to Mexicans, Central Americans, South Americans, Cubans, Dominicans, and Puerto Ricans. And those from Puerto Rico are actually U.S. citizens, so immigration clearly doesn't apply in this case because they're akin to moving to a different state. And in the United States, out of all of those groups, people of Mexican descent are the largest portion of Latinx immigrants. And in 2010, there were 50 million Latinx people living within the United States, making them the largest minority group living in the country. So larger portion of the population was a Latinx background than African American background, for instance. As had traditionally been the case with minority immigrants, the opportunities were lacking for educational opportunities and employment opportunities. So there was a higher rate of poverty than the average. Asian Americans, mostly made up of people from the Koreas, India, Japan, Cambodia, Vietnam, and China. Obviously, there are others, but that's the majority of what was making up the Asian immigrant population in the 1990s. And they came in with this strong emphasis on education that they translated to the United States. And there's been a strong representation of Asian Americans in college and university system, and it's one of those stereotypes that Asian Americans are known by. In 2007, the median Asian American income was higher than the median white American income, but it does seem that there was very little middle ground, so either people were at the top of this spectrum or they were living in poverty, essentially, with very little space in between in the middle class. For African Americans, there was no more legal segregation based on race, but it doesn't mean that there wasn't and remains de facto segregation. De facto segregation is the plain fact that living situations and schooling situations are still typically segregated by race based on previous policies. So if neighborhood construction and the legacy of barring particular races from different neighborhoods continued and people built lives and people built communities, then that bleeds over into the school system as well. And because property taxes often pay for schools, those with lower property taxes are going to have less money for schools. So if the neighborhoods are still essentially racially segregated, and if African Americans were making less money than white Americans on the whole, this means that there's less money going into, for example, inner city schools. There were unprecedented numbers of African Americans, however, in corporate America and across the board in employment. This was a huge leap in achievement for race relations in the United States. There were also many immigrants coming from different African nations at this point, and more than half of them had college education if they made it here. And this contributed to what many people refer to as brain drain in the African nations where they came from. And it was because people were seeking opportunities that weren't available to them in their birth countries or in their neighboring countries. Another issue that came up in striking form was the problem of police conduct for Black Americans. And the 1992 Rodney King riots in LA are the epitome of this movement at this point. We know that this is still an issue that the United States is grappling with today. And these riots followed the beating of Rodney King by white police officers, and it was caught on tape. And even though it was caught on tape, an all-white jury let the police officers off the hook and cleared them of charges, and this led to a riot in which 52 people died and about $1 billion in damage was done in LA. I've included a PBS clip on Rodney King here for you to watch, and this is one of the more major riots of the 90s. It's definitely widely remembered by those who were alive at the time, and I suspect it will continue to make its way into the history books. Another issue facing the United States in this realm was the problem of imprisonment. This is still something that we're dealing with the consequences of today. Since the 1970s, there had been this idea of being tough on crime, and that focused on locking people up rather than focusing on rehabilitating them. And there was an overwhelming majority of those who pass through the prison system who are released eventually. So by not acknowledging that rehabilitation could be useful, it was a relatively large oversight and led to a lot of recidivism, meaning people returning to jail. Drug addiction was pictured, and still is in many places, as a crime rather than a disease in need of treatment. So people were jailed for having drug addictions as they are these days. And most of those incarcerated were in jail due to nonviolent drug crimes. And by 2011, there were 2.3 million people in jail in the United States. This is 10 times the amount that were in jail in 1970. And there were millions more that were on parole or probation. The United States had 1/4 of the world's inmates. So you can see on the map to the right here that the United States incarcerates a larger share of its population than any other country. And you can see the different rates based on the scale. And the part of this jump in incarceration and concern with drug crimes is the classification of crack versus cocaine. So while they're the same drug in a different concentration, crack was often associated with the African American community, and cocaine was associated with white men in the suburbs. And one of these went to jail, and the other typically did not. So many more African Americans were locked up than white Americans. One of the quicker turnarounds in U.S. history in public opinion was about gay rights. And in the 1980s, the gay rights movement had been dominated by the struggle to understand what was happening with AIDS virus, and this had popped up and decimated the gay populations, especially in New York City and San Francisco. There were gay rights groups that were focused on funding a cure for AIDS and for funding research into how to delay or stop it. And part of this process was the promotion of the AZT drug, which was kept off the markets, and essentially companies were trying to figure out how to make money instead of releasing drugs in an emergency situation. About 400,000 Americans had died of AIDS by the year 2000. And politicians took note of the plight of LGBT people at this point and started taking them into consideration, and not even necessarily understanding at that point that they likely knew many gay people, but they saw this opening of a pocket of culture that they hadn't before had much access to. And I do want to point out the Time cover here. Ellen DeGeneres, it was a cover story in 1997 for her to come out and explain why she came out. And she did so on TV also on her show. Her character was a lesbian, and this was a shocking show for a lot of people, and it sort of took the nation by storm. People wanted to talk about it. Multiculturalism is backing all of this up. So it's the underlying movement behind a lot of this attempt at understanding different people's experiences. So one of the major holdups here was that there was this sense of the consensus model leaving and cultural fragmentation of the nation becoming the new norm. There were questions that people were asking, like, should people be forced to learn English? There were at least 23 states by the year 2000 that had English as their official language. And this is part of the culture wars, but the culture wars also refers to this battle over moral values. So we talked about that rise in religious fervor in response to this secularization, and part of that saw groups like the Christian Coalition, which was an evangelical group, rise up, which was anti-gay, anti-abortion rights, and anti-secular schooling, and anti-government aid to the arts. So they would categorize themselves, obviously, as saying that they were pro-traditional marriage and pro-life and pro-allowing prayer to re-enter schools. And one of the things that they did manage to achieve was that in many localities, creationism was required to be taught alongside evolution in science class. So you start to see these strict traditional and religious ideas sneaking back in. And families at this point were also starting to change in their structure. So divorce was a result of half of marriages. 40% of births were to unmarried women, and less than half of households, people living together, were married couples. So people didn't feel the need to be married before they lived together. So it's a change in what had previously happened. And about 2/3 of married women worked outside of the home, and that further pushed the traditional gender roles out of the way. So we know that this is not a battle that is over, but it is obviously much more accepted today that women work outside of the home once they're married and have children than it would have been 50 years ago. In 1992, abortion rights were once again held up by the courts, but states were now allowed to make rules such as mandatory waiting periods and anti-abortion counseling. They did, however, do away with the requirement that a woman's husband must be notified of the choice she made about keeping the pregnancy or not. On the extreme end of the conservative movement, you had people like Timothy McVeigh, who bombed a federal office building in Oklahoma City because he was anti-government. This killed 168 people, including many children who were attending a daycare in the building. He was later captured, put on trial, and executed for this crime. He was one of many people who were on the fringes of these extreme right-wing groups, and they were focused on things like racism and anti-Semitism and anti-governmental concerns. They were typically against any sort of government oversight. And some even formed private militias in order to, as they saw it, protect the border between the United States and Mexico themselves. Another point of contention through this time frame, and an obvious glaring instance of misdeeds, was the impeachment of Bill Clinton. So even though he was considered to be a centrist. There were many conservatives who disapproved of his past as a marijuana user, as an anti-war protester, for having married a feminist woman, and for having levied support for gay rights. So many of those things had still turned off conservatives to him. In 1998, the Monica Lewinsky scandal broke, and it became clear that the president had had a sexual relationship with a White House intern. And there were many other allegations of this same nature. We're in the Me Too era now, where this has become abundantly clear, but it goes without saying this is not the only misdeed he is accused of taking part in. And in December of 1998, the Republican-dominated House of Representatives voted to impeach the president for perjury and obstruction of justice. Now, being impeached by the House does not necessarily mean that you are removed from office. In 1999, Clinton was tried before the Senate, but there was not a majority vote to warrant his removal from office. So while he was impeached by the House, he was not removed from office by the Senate. And the general public, on the whole, found the trial to be more obnoxious than the slimy actions themselves. So people felt that the crime that he committed was not worthy of this sort of reaction, essentially. That was the nearing the end of his presidency, and there was an election in 2000 that took place, and this was between Vice President Al Gore, who had been chosen by the Democratic nominee, and he was running with Joe Lieberman as his vice president running mate. And Joe Lieberman was the first Jewish vice presidential nominee. George W. Bush, who was the son of former president and governor of Texas, was set up as a Republican nominee and chose Dick Cheney, who was the former Secretary of Defense, as his VP running mate. It took an entire month after the election day to determine the winner of the election because there were some irregularities in the Florida ballots. So people talked a lot about hanging chads or dimpled chads. They were talking about paper ballots that it wasn't entirely clear visually who the voter had voted for. By the end of it, Al Gore came out having won the popular vote by a slim margin, and eventually the Supreme Court of the United States had to decide what to do about the electoral votes because it was too close to call. They decided that Florida's governor should certify the results, and the governor of Florida at the time was George W. Bush's brother, Jeb Bush. And as we know, the election went to George W. Bush. And some of the questions that came up at this point was, what did it mean for the country that someone who had not taken the popular vote had won the election? And what did that mean for democracy? This had happened 3 times before. In 1824, John Quincy Adams won without having won the popular vote, and this was the largest gap. He lost the popular vote by about 10%. In 1876, it had been a very close race again. Rutherford B. Hayes ended up winning the electoral vote without winning the popular vote. And in 1888, same thing, very close. Benjamin Harrison won. But 1888 to the year 2000, it hadn't happened again. And it has now happened one other time since the 2000 election, and that was in 2016. Donald Trump did not win the popular vote, but did win the Electoral College. The first major issue that George Bush had to deal with as president, as we know, was 9/11. So September 11th, 2001, Around 8 a.m., there were 4 jetliners that were taken hostage by al-Qaeda agents. 2 planes that were full of passengers were crashed into the World Trade Center Twin Towers in New York City, which then proceeded to collapse. And 1 plane was crashed into the wing of the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and another plane was grounded by passengers who fought back once they were aware of the situation in the country. They found out through their cell phones what had been going on. And they crashed that plane with the hijackers on board in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. In total, there were 19 hijackers, about 200 passengers on the planes, 400 police and firefighters who entered the buildings before they collapsed. There were the pilots, the flight attendants, and the victims on the ground. And all of this totaled up to about 3,000 people dead from this single attack. It's a coordinated attack, so we can call it a single attack, even though it was several different places. Al-Qaeda was quickly blamed for this and took ownership over it, with Osama bin Laden as the leader of the group. And he had previously worked with the United States in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union and received a lot of funding to build hideouts in the mountains from the United States. And following the Gulf War, he turned on the United States and was further upset even after that with U.S. support for Israel in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So this is where the 20th century essentially ends. Of course, it ends in the year 2000, but many people will just extend it a few months to September 11th because it seems like a natural breaking point. This is one of those points in U.S. history or in world history even that things take a turn and become notably different following an event. So we'll talk more about that in the lecture to come that will bring us up to almost all the way to current day.